Welcome to the deep dive. We're taking a look at this handbook all about freight management for the U.S. government.
Mm.
Looks like someone sent this in, so they must know it's dense. It's a lot of regulations and acronyms and all that fun stuff. We'll break it down, though.
Yeah, we'll make it easy. We'll go through all that legalese and find those important parts, the stuff that really matters. So you can kind of understand, how the government moves things around, everything from tanks to thumbtacks and why they have all these rules in the first place.
Okay, perfect. Let's jump right in. One thing that jumped out to me was the Bill of Lading, BOL for short. The handbook really emphasizes how important this document is.
Yeah, it is. It's way more than just like a receipt. It's
Hmm.
like a contract. It's the official record of everything.
Right.
And it can even be used like as evidence if there's disagreements or disputes. What I found interesting was they have all these specialized BOLs for different situations. They even have one like for when a government employee moves, like if they're relocating. There's a specific form for the Department of Defense, the SF 1203.
Oh, wow. So, like, if a government employee is moving their stuff, there's a whole separate process and form just for that.
Yep. And the handbook, it makes it really clear that issuing the BOL after the freight service is done is a big no-no.
Why? What's the big deal? It's just a piece of paper.
Not really. I mean, the BOL, it lays out the terms of the agreement up front. Like, think about it, like you wouldn't sign a contract after the work's already been done, right? It wouldn't hold up. So the government, by, focusing on this upfront documentation, they're basically emphasizing transparency and accountability from the start.
It's like setting the ground rules day one.
Exactly. And speaking of rules, let's talk about another thing that caught my attention, the prepayment audits.
Okay, audits. That word always makes me nervous.
Well, the government, they're all about being financially responsible, and prepayment audits, that's a big part of that. What's interesting is they require these audits for every agency and for literally every shipment.
Hold on. So even for, like, a small shipment, they're checking the bill before they pay.
You got it. Even if you're just using, like, a charge card for a tiny package, they want to make sure everything is correct before any money goes out. It shows, how seriously they take preventing overspending.
It's like they have this financial watchdog, constantly looking over their shoulder.
It's a great way to put it. And what else is interesting? Agencies can choose how they want to do these audits. They can handle it themselves, hire a contractor, or even use some kind of third-party system. But there's a catch.
Okay, I figured there'd be a catch. What is it?
They have to get their plan, whatever plan they choose, approved by the GSA. That's the General Services Administration. They're like the overseers, making sure everything's by the book.
So basically, the GSA has the final say on whether an agency's audit plan is good enough. That's a lot of power.
Yeah, they're the gatekeepers. And another interesting thing about these audits, the same company can't be both the shipper and the auditor.
Wait, why not? Wouldn't that just be easier? I mean, wouldn't that be more efficient?
Well, think about it. If the same company is shipping the goods and then also checking their own bill, that's a conflict of interest, right? It would be like grading your own homework.
Oh, yeah. Good point. It's
Yeah.
all about that, those checks and balances, making sure everything is above board.
Exactly. And just when you think you're done with auditing, there's another layer. They also do post-payment audits.
Really. So they audit before the payment
Yeah.
and then again after. Isn't that a bit much?
Maybe it seems that way, but it's actually a pretty smart system. They take all the paid bills, all the receipts and everything, and send it to the GSA. That way they can double check and make sure nothing was missed.
Okay, so they're really thorough. Guess it's all about making sure that taxpayer money is being spent wisely.
Absolutely. And this double audit thing, it really shows how important record keeping is, For anyone involved in government shipping, you got to be ready for those potential cost adjustments down the line. They don't mess around when it comes to money.
So it's not just about following the rules, it's about understanding why those rules are in place.
Yeah, precisely. And the why behind these regulations, it goes beyond just the money. Like, they also have strong preferences when it comes to who they choose to do the shipping. Take cargo preference laws, for example.
All right, we talked about that earlier.
Yeah.
That's the thing about using American ships and airplanes for government shipments whenever possible, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And those laws are interesting because they're trying to do a few things at once. They want to support American businesses and jobs, which is great, but it can also mean higher costs sometimes.
So it's a trade-off.
Yeah, for sure. And the handbook lays out a bunch of requirements for, actually following these laws. Like, one thing that stood out to me was the really specific reporting requirements. For any international ocean shipment, you have to send all the documentation to the Maritime Administration. MARAD.
Wow, they really don't cut any corners, like this whole web of regulations, but it's starting to make more sense now.
Yeah, it's definitely complex, but there's a reason for everything. Okay, so now imagine you need to transport something super valuable or super sensitive.
Okay, valuable or sensitive, I'm thinking like top secret documents, or like
Okay.
priceless artifacts, or maybe even like hazardous materials.
Yeah, you're getting the idea. So in those cases, the government, they might decide to use what they call exclusive use of a vehicle.
Oh, right, exclusive use. So that means you basically get a whole truck or a plane or whatever all to yourself.
Yeah.
But the handbook, it actually cautioned against using this unless it's absolutely necessary.
It did, and that's what I found interesting. They're really focused on cost effectiveness, even in those situations. It's
Yeah.
not just about security or convenience. It's about being smart with taxpayer money.
Right. So no private jets just because you feel like it.
Unless you have a really, really good reason.
Got it.
Yeah.
So what about when things change? Like, let's say a shipment is already on its way, but then the destination changes. How do they handle that?
Oh, that's where reconsignment and diversion come in. It actually happens more often than you think, destinations change or priorities shift, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it makes sense. Things happen.
Mm.
But how do they make sure the shipments end up in the right place after all those changes?
The handbook has procedures for that, like how to make those changes while the stuff is already in transit, and it really highlights how important clear communication and documentation are. Like, that's a big takeaway for anyone involved in logistics, not just government shipping.
Oh, so even if you're not shipping tanks or top secret documents, this information is still useful.
Absolutely. It's all about avoiding those logistical nightmares, having a system.
Okay, well, speaking of nightmares, what happens when something gets damaged in shipping? Who's responsible for that?
That's a great question. And it brings us to damage claims.
Uh-oh. Damaged cargo. That's got to be a pain.
It can be. The GSA audits we talked about, those don't actually cover damage claims. But the handbook has a whole section on it. It talks about deadlines for filing claims, what documents you need, and even this tricky thing called concealed damage.
Concealed damage. What's that?
It's when the damage isn't obvious right away. So like a crate looks fine from the outside, but when you open it up, everything inside is broken. That's concealed damage.
Oh, it's tricky. So what should you do if that happens?
Well, the handbook is really clear about this. You got to note any damage, anything you see on the BOL at the time of delivery.
Even if it's not obvious. Why is that so important?
Because if you don't document it right then and there, it's much harder to prove that the damage happened during shipping, and then it's a whole mess to file a claim later.
So basically, documentation is key in every step of government shipping.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Every little detail matters.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground already, and it's clear that government freight management is, well, it's complicated. But it's been fascinating to see how much thought they put into it. Like, everything is designed to ensure accountability and efficiency.
Yeah, and we're just getting started.
Right. So stay tuned for part 2, where we'll get into even more specifics about the bill of lading and other fascinating aspects of government freight. Welcome back to the deep dive. We're picking up where we left off, talking about all the ins and outs of government freight management. And last time we saw just how detail-oriented they are and how like everything comes back to accountability.
It's true. It's not just about the rules themselves. It's about like the whole philosophy behind it.
Yeah.
And let's dive into some more specifics now.
Okay, sounds good. What's next?
So let's take another look at that bill of lading, the BOL. There was one thing in particular that really stood out to me, and that's the requirement for standard point location codes.
SPLCs. Those are, what are those all about?
Yeah, so they're like special codes, 9 digits long, and the Department of Defense uses them to identify like the origin and destination of shipments. Think of it like a zip code, but specifically for military bases and facilities.
Okay, yeah. That makes sense. With all the cargo they're moving, they need something really precise to keep track of it all.
Right. And it's not just about locations. The handbook, it also talks about making sure it's super clear who's paying for the transportation, like who's responsible for those charges. It has to be stated right there on the BOL.
Yeah, that's important. You can't just assume that the government's footing the bill for everything, right?
Not necessarily, no. Sometimes there are contractors involved or other parties, and it's really important to be clear about where that invoice needs to go. Imagine if those bills got sent to the wrong place. What a mess.
Yeah, I can only imagine. So basically, it's all about, like, avoiding confusion, Making sure everyone knows what's going on.
Exactly. Which brings us to marks and annotations on the BOL.
Marks and annotations. That sounds kind of mysterious. What's that all about?
So think of it like this. It's a way to add like extra information, little details to help make sure everything goes smoothly, with the handling and the delivery and all that.
Oh, okay. So like special instructions for the people who are handling the shipment.
Yeah, exactly. Like you could write fragile or keep refrigerated, things like that. Or maybe you need to give more details about what's actually in the shipments, like an extra layer of communication just to be safe.
It's all about the little things,
Yeah,
preventing those, mix-ups or mistakes.
exactly. Now let's talk about something that might seem kind of basic, but it's actually really crucial: weights.
Weights. Okay. Why is that so important?
Well, remember, transportation costs are often based on weight. So getting those numbers right, that's really important. The handbook is very specific about how to report those weights, pounds only. And you got to be clear whether it's the actual weight, an estimated weight, or an agreed weight.
So if you don't know the exact weight,
Hmm.
you can't just, guess.
Nope. You got to be upfront about it, mark it as an estimate, and then, of course, correct it later once you know the actual weight.
Seems like a lot of work, but I guess it prevents those, arguments or disagreements later on.
Right. Okay, now get ready for this one. This might surprise you. The handbook actually has a section about handling hazardous materials.
Wait, hazardous materials? That's serious stuff.
It is. The government ships all kinds of things, and some of it requires special handling.
So how do they make sure it's all safe and that it's following all the rules and regulations?
Transparency is key. Like, the BOL has to very clearly state that there are hazardous materials in the shipment, and it needs to have all the right certifications, warnings, all of that. There's no messing around when it comes to safety.
Makes sense. It's like a big warning sign, Handle with care.
Exactly. Now, I know there are parts of the BOL that can seem a little confusing, like those services and rates sections.
Oh, yeah, those are always confusing to me. I never know what to make of them.
Well, those are mainly for the transportation service provider, the TSP, to fill out. It's where they put down, like, the services they provided and how much it costs.
So if I'm the one shipping something, can I just ignore those sections?
Well, not completely. It's still a good idea to look them over and make sure the charges are what you agreed to, just to avoid any surprises later on.
So even though it's their job to fill it out, it's still smart to, double check.
Always. Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about those cargo preference laws again.
Cargo preference. Right. That's the rule about using American ships and airplanes whenever possible to support American businesses.
Exactly. It's about keeping those jobs and those dollars in the U.S. transportation industry.
Yeah, it's good for the economy. I get it. It's a priority.
It is. And the handbook, it goes into a lot of detail about the specific requirements. Like, one interesting thing I noticed is that for any international ocean shipment, you have to send all the documentation to the Maritime Administration, or MARAD for short.
So it's not enough to just say you're using an American carrier. You have to prove it.
Yep. And they want to keep track of everything, make sure those laws are being followed.
Wow, it just adds another layer of complexity. But it makes sense. Documentation is, the most important thing in government shipping.
It's true. Okay, now imagine a situation where you need to ship something really, really important, something valuable, sensitive, maybe even classified information.
Okay, top secret stuff. Got it.
Right. In those cases, you might need to request what's called exclusive use of a vehicle.
Oh, right. We talked about that before. It's like getting a private jet for your cargo. But the handbook said to only use that if it's absolutely necessary. Because it's expensive, right?
It is, and that's what I found interesting, how much they emphasize cost effectiveness. Even in those, high security situations. It's a good reminder that responsible spending is always a priority.
No matter what you're shipping.
Right. So what about those times when things don't go according to plan? Let's say a shipment is already on its way, but then all of a sudden the destination changes.
Oh, yeah, those last-minute changes. I could see how that could happen a lot with government shipping. So how do they deal with that?
Well, that's where you get into reconsignment and diversion. Those are the terms they use when you change the destination or the route of a shipment that's already in transit.
That makes sense. Things change, priorities shift. Sometimes you got to redirect things.
Exactly. And the handbook lays out the procedures for doing that. And
Yeah.
again, it highlights how important clear communication is and good documentation. Even when things are changing, you got to have a system in place to keep everything running smoothly.
It sounds like they've really thought of everything.
They try. Okay, so now let's talk about how those transportation providers actually get paid. It's not just a matter of sending an invoice, is it?
I have a feeling it's not that simple. Government billing always seems so complicated.
You're right, it is. They have very specific forms and procedures to make sure everything is accurate and that payments happen on time. The handbook goes through it all, and one key form is the SF 1113. It's called the Public Voucher for Transportation Charges.
SF 1113. Got it. Another form to add to the list.
It's all part of the system. This form, it has all the details about the services, the charges, and the payment info. It's like a complete record of the whole transaction.
So it's like the final step to make sure everything is in order.
Exactly. And the handbook stresses how important it is to fill this form out correctly. Any mistakes can lead to delays in getting paid, or even disagreements and disputes.
Yeah, I bet. One last chance to double-check everything.
Right. And speaking of double-checking, let's go back to those damage claims. We talked about how to document damage when a shipment arrives, but what happens next? How do you actually go about filing a claim?
That's a good question.
Well, the handbook's a great resource for this. It has info on deadlines, what documents you need, and even those concealed damage situations.
Right, concealed damage. That's when you don't see the damage right away.
Exactly. And it just highlights how important it is to really inspect those shipments carefully when they arrive and to document anything that looks even a little bit off, even if it doesn't seem like a big deal at the time.
Because if you don't, it'll be hard to prove it happened during shipping.
Right. It's all about protecting yourself.
Okay, I'm seeing the theme here. Documentation is key every step of the way.
You got it. It's what holds it all together.
Well, we've covered a lot in this part of our deep dive. From the bill of lading to cargo preference laws and all those audit systems.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing how much goes into government freight.
It is, and there's still more to uncover.
Stay tuned for our final part where we'll wrap things up and leave you with some things to think about. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been spending this episode really digging into this government freight management handbook. It's pretty intense. You know, with all the documentation and the audits, it's clear they're serious about how they move things around.
Yeah, no kidding. And it's not just about following the rules. It's about understanding why they're there. You know, that whole focus on accountability and efficiency and making sure, taxpayer money is being used wisely.
Exactly.
Mhm.
So for this last part, let's look at a few more interesting things from this handbook. What else stood out to you?
Well, one thing that I thought was really interesting is how, even with all these regulations, technology is becoming more and more important. Like, the handbook specifically mentions computer-generated BOLs.
So they're using computers to create those bill of lading forms.
Yeah, in a way. Agencies can use electronic systems to generate the forms, but there's a catch.
Of course there is. What is it?
Even though they're generated electronically when they're printed out, they still have to follow all those standard specifications.
So no shortcuts just because you're using a computer?
Nope. Same rules apply. The form has to be the right size, have all the correct wording and layout, even be printed on the right kind of paper.
It's all about consistency, making sure everything is standardized.
Right. Okay, so here's a fun one. What happens when a BOL goes missing?
Oh, lost documents. That's always a headache.
It is. But the handbook actually has procedures for that. Like, if the transportation service provider can't find the original BOL, they can use a certified copy for billing.
Oh, okay. So there's a backup plan.
Yeah. But it's really important to make sure that copy is certified correctly and that everyone knows what's going on, to avoid any duplicate payments or confusion.
It's all about communication.
Exactly. And while we're talking about accuracy, let's touch on how to handle corrections to the BOL. We all make mistakes, so how do you fix something on a document that's this important?
You can't just, cross something out, right?
Right. They have a specific form for that, the SF 1200. It's called the Government Bill of Lading Correction Notice.
Seriously.
Yeah.
Another form.
Yeah, they have a form for everything. This one lets you make changes to the original BOL without having to create a whole new one.
Oh, okay. So what kind of corrections are we talking about?
It could be anything, really, like fixing a typo or updating the destination or adding some special handling instructions, just making sure everything on the BOL is accurate and up to date.
And I'm sure they want you to document those corrections really carefully, right?
Of course, every change needs to be tracked. Okay, so let's wrap things up with one last point that really shows how committed the government is to accountability, and it all comes back to those audits.
Right, the audits. We know they're a big deal.
They are, and the handbook is very specific about how agencies need to submit those paid transportation bills for the post-payment audits.
Wait, so even after they've paid the bills, the GSA still wants to check them?
Yep. It's all about making sure everything was accurate, catching any mistakes, and just making sure, that taxpayer money was spent properly.
It's like one final check.
Exactly.
Yeah.
During these post-payment audits, the GSA, they go through those bills with a fine-tooth comb. They check that the charges are right, that the right rates were used, that all the paperwork is there.
Sounds thorough.
It is. And the handbook really stresses how important it is for agencies to submit all the information correctly and completely. If there are any discrepancies, it can delay payments or even result in penalties.
So attention to detail is crucial, from start to finish.
Absolutely.
Well, I have to say, I'm feeling a lot more informed about government freight management now. It's complicated,
Yeah.
but it's fascinating, to see how much thought goes into it.
I agree.
They've really created a system that prioritizes efficiency and transparency and accountability.
They have. And remember, this was just a deep dive, We just scratched the surface. There's always more to learn in the handbook itself.
Right, but now you have the key takeaways and a better understanding of how it all works.
And hopefully a new appreciation for all the work that goes into moving those tanks and thumbtacks.
Absolutely. And here's one last thing to think about. With all the changes happening in the world, with e-commerce and global supply chains getting more and more complex, how do you think the government will need to adapt these practices in the future? It's something to consider as you navigate your own work. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.